Greetings. I'm Brooke Learman, Maryland's 34th Comptroller. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar discussing the tax law changes resulting from the 2025 BRFA passed by the General Assembly. Let me start by saying thank you for doing business in Maryland, and thank you for joining us today. Our tax system is one of voluntary compliance, and we are doing our best to make sure that you and everybody else who's affected by any changes in the tax law have the information that you need to comply. Since the end of session, our agency has been hard at work implementing these tax changes that the General Assembly passed during this year's legislative session. The Office of the Comptroller of Maryland has a long history in providing timely updates to Marylanders, informing them of tax changes and updates. And I'm pleased to continue this tradition with some added features, including these interactive webinars, in addition to public outreach efforts, FAQs, one-pagers, and other opportunities our agency is creating to ensure that you have your questions answered. I know that this kind of change can be intimidating, especially if your business is implementing a new tax for the first time, but we're here to make sure you have all the tools you need to make this process as easy as possible. To ensure that you can follow our progress and get further updates, we've created a web page on our new website, marylandcomptroller.gov. This page is dedicated to tax updates from the 2025 legislative session. There, you'll find a recording of this and all other webinars and other important updates from our agency regarding these changes. Thank you again for joining this webinar, and thank you for doing business in Maryland. Your success is so important to us. Our teams are excited to delve deeper into these topics, update you on the process so far, and answer your questions. With that, I'll turn it over to the team. Please stay in touch.
Hello. Thank you for joining our webinar to discuss state tax updates from the 2025 session of the Maryland General Assembly. A quick housekeeping note before we begin. Since the end of the legislative session, we've collected questions from stakeholders about the tax law changes, and we've done our best to incorporate answers to those questions into today's presentation. Additionally, as the comptroller just mentioned, we've created a page on our website, marylandcomptroller.gov, that's dedicated to providing information about these law changes. This will include frequently asked questions and answers, draft regulations, and other guidance, as well as a recording of this webinar. While we will not be able to answer questions directly during today's presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A feature if you have a question that is not addressed. We will try to incorporate that into future updates of the information on our website. Please do not include any confidential or proprietary information in the Q&A or the chat. Now on to the updates. Today, we're going to begin with updates related to income taxes. I know that this is our tech session, so I am going to move through that portion somewhat quickly because I know many of you are eager to hear about the sales and use tax updates as they relate to data and IT services. Next, we will talk about the expansion of the sales and use tax base through the addition of new taxable services. A 3% tax on the sale of data or information technology services, and also software publishing services. Understanding that there are many businesses in the technology field that have never had to charge or collect sales and use tax before, I'm going to talk a bit about sales and use tax generally, including the obligations of sellers and buyers. I'll talk about the effective date of the legislation and how that impacts contracts that are in progress and subscriptions. I'll cover some special situations, including exemptions, and then round out the sales and use tax portion with updates on items that are other than technology. And then finally, I will turn the presentation over to my colleague who will share practical information and a walkthrough on opening a sales and use tax account in Maryland Tax Connect, which is our online portal for filing and remitting sales and use tax. Unless I specifically state otherwise, the income tax changes here are applicable beginning with tax years 2025 and forward. For tax year 2025, the top marginal rate increases and 2 additional brackets and tax rates are added. The current top rate of 5.75% is now capped at 500,000 for single, married, filing separate, and dependent filers, and 600,000 for joint, head of household, and qualifying surviving spouses. You'll see a new bracket is added at the 6.25% rate, and then the new top marginal rate is 6.50%. This is for filers with Maryland taxable income in excess of $1 million or 1.2, depending on your filing status. Counties are permitted to impose their county income tax at a rate up to 3.3%. That was formerly 3.2% maximum. And just a note, interest for the underpayment of estimated tax is going to be waived for tax year 2025 if a taxpayer's underpayment would not have occurred but for the increase in the income tax rates. Now I'm going to talk about the 2025 standard deduction. The minimum standard deduction is increased to $3,350 for individuals married filing separate and dependents, $6,700 for joint, head of household, and qualifying surviving spouses. The phase-in that was formerly in place, that is eliminated with the 2025 session. So everyone with the same filing status claiming the standard deduction is going to receive the same amount, regardless of their income. Next, I'll talk about itemized deductions. If you itemize on your federal return, you are permitted to itemize your deductions on your Maryland return. However, beginning with tax year 2025, the itemized deductions are now phased out for high income taxpayers. Federal adjusted gross income exceeding $100,000 for married filing separate and all other filing statuses, that phase out begins at $200,000. The amount of itemized deductions that's otherwise allowed is reduced by 7.5% of the amount of federal adjusted gross income that is in excess of the applicable threshold. On to the new capital gains surtax. The law imposes a 2% surtax on net capital gain that is included in Maryland adjusted gross income if the federal adjusted gross income exceeds $350,000. This is for all filing statuses. And it excludes gains from sales of what you see there, the exceptions that are listed, including a sale of a primary residence for less than 1.5 million, and also an exception for assets held in certain tax advantage benefit plans or retirement accounts. The definition of the net capital gain is the amount as defined and determined under the Internal Revenue Code. So Maryland does not have its own definition. As I stated, that income threshold to trigger the capital gains is $350,000. State income tax now will equal the Maryland taxable income multiplied by the applicable tax rate plus the capital gains surtax amount, if any. The surtax is going to apply to capital gains that are passed through to individuals from pass-through entities and fiduciaries. Form K1 will need to indicate that the amount of capital gains being distributed for each individual. All right, I'll move on now to the sales and use tax, the data or information technology services and software publishing services. And let's talk about what's taxable, what is actually subject to this sales and use tax beginning July 1st, 2025. The law creates new taxable services at a 3% rate. What services? The law says that data or information technology services that are described under NAICS or NAICS sectors 518 or 519 or as subsector 5415, and also system software or application software publishing services that are described under NAICS subsector 5132. All of these are subject to the sales and use tax effective July 1st of 2025. Those services that are subject to the tax, as I just mentioned, they're defined by reference to the NAICS sectors. And NAICS stands for North American Industry Classification System. The law specifies that you're to use the 2022 edition. Services that meet these definitions are taxable, whether or not a business reports these sectors as their primary business activity code. And it's regardless of whether the NAICS sector is assigned to a procurement or contract. These are descriptions of the activity that is being sold. If you visit www.census.gov/NAICS, you can enter the appropriate code in the search field for more details. And there's a little snip on screen there of what that NAICS search looks like. And again, highlighting, you want the box that says 2022 NAICS search. Once you do that, you will click on the link for a subsector. Here I happen to have chosen subsector 5415, and you'll get search results. Each of the highlighted records there on screen, that is a link to further descriptions. So if you click on one of those, I've chosen, for example, 5541511, which is custom computer programming. And that will bring up a list of the activities that are included. So all of these activities are included as subordinate to the NAICS subsector 5415. So performing any of these activities and selling that service is something that becomes taxable after July 1st. Now, to assist taxpayers, we have taken all of the relevant activity descriptions from the NAICS codes listed in the bill and included them in our emergency regulations and other guidance that is available on marylandcomptroller.gov. We've had some questions about what qualifies as an IT service and what is a digital product and how to differentiate those things. I would say check out the list of services. And if you are using the census website here for NAICS, please just make sure you're using the 2022 edition. For example, if you're charging for packaged computer application software, that is one of the listed products or activities, then as of July 1st, 2025, you are providing a taxable service and will be required to charge the tax when you make sales, but for any other exemptions. Should you rely on a code if it's used in another context, such as on a tax return? No. Please check the list of services and make sure you're using the 2022 edition. Don't rely on codes that necessarily you may have been using for a number of years without checking them. For example, if you just perform a quick web search for software publishing, you're going to get a lot of search results that refer to subsector 511.210 for software publishers. However, 511.210 is no longer a valid NAICS code in the 2022 edition. Instead, software publishers are now under 5132 in the 2022 edition. What matters is, are you charging customers for any of the listed services? So now we'll talk next about who has to collect and remit the sales and use tax. The legislature did not change the foundational sales and use tax law that we are all familiar with when we buy tangible goods. What they did, they merely expanded the base by adding new services to the list of taxable services that already existed. And I think that's important to understand in terms of applying the existing law and the regulations. The same sales and use tax principles apply, whether you're selling t-shirts or if you're selling technology. The Comptroller's Office is not breaking any new ground here. We are trying to assist taxpayers in understanding how those laws apply to the sale of data and IT services and to software publishing services. So in Maryland, the law calls sellers, they call them vendors. So we'll be using the term vendors. And vendors who are selling or delivering tangible personal property, digital codes, digital products, or taxable services in Maryland, they must register for a sales and use tax account. And they are required by law to collect the sales and use tax on retail sale unless an exemption applies. The law breaks out three different types of sellers who are responsible for collecting the tax. First, we have in-state sellers who are selling to a Maryland buyer. Next, if you're an out-of-state seller that has physical presence in Maryland, that could be property or sending someone into the state to perform services. That will require, you're selling to a Maryland buyer, you must collect tax on that. And then there's a category called remote sellers. And these sellers, they have no physical presence in Maryland, but if selling to a Maryland buyer, then there are thresholds that we must look at. So the seller is required to collect Maryland sales and use tax if during the previous calendar year or the current calendar year, the vendor meets the following criteria. If they've gross revenue from the sale of tangible personal property or taxable services delivered into Maryland exceeding $100,000. So gross revenue, that is all sales, not to a single customer, but across the board to all customers. Or if they make sales of tangible personal property or taxable services for delivery into Maryland in 200 or more separate transactions. Exceeding either of those two will impose a requirement to collect the tax. You may hear these thresholds described as Wayfair thresholds. If you hear that term, that just refers to the Supreme Court case in which the remote seller decision was rendered and allows states to impose an obligation to collect the sales and use tax on remote sellers. Gotten this question a lot, so just want to be clear. A vendor that is in Maryland, who's making a sale to a customer outside of Maryland, does not need to charge the Maryland sales and use tax. You may need to charge sales and use tax for the other state, depending on the laws in the buyer's state. But if you are making sales to a customer who is fully outside of Maryland, you're not required to collect the Maryland sales and use tax. Vendors must have a sales and use tax license, and that's obtained by completing a combined registration application. You can visit Maryland Tax Connect, mdtaxconnect.gov to apply. There is no fee for a sales and use tax license, and my colleague is going to go through the details of that a little later in the presentation. It's important to understand that a vendor who is collecting sales and use tax, they're a trustee for the state. The sales and use tax that's collected is collected in trust, and the vendor is liable for the collection of the sales and use tax for and on account of the state. The tax is generally due at the time of sale. We'll talk about some exceptions a little later. As part of the obligation, vendors must file a sales and use tax return and remit the payment of all the tax that they've collected on or before the 20th of the month following the month when the sale is made. There is a credit available for vendors who are timely filing and paying sales and use tax. So it's 0.9% of the gross amount of the tax remitted, up to a maximum of $500 per return. And the thinking there is that will help vendors offset their costs of collection and compliance. Interest and late payment penalty will apply if the tax is not remitted on a timely basis. And additionally, certain officers and responsible individuals who are required to remit the payment, they can be held personally liable if the sales and use tax is not remitted to the state. So that is a big no-no. Don't collect sales and use tax and then fail to pay it over to the state. Next, I've got a couple of snips of the sales and use tax form, which is Form 202. And I apologize, I realize it's a little bit fuzzy, but I just wanted to convey here, these are updates to the sales and use tax form that you'll be seeing starting July 1st. The total sales of data and IT services and software publishing services, as well as the actual tax collected, are going to be reported on a new line 16. So that's the sales. And then if there are taxable purchases of these services for use where tax is not paid to the seller, that is going to be reported on the new line 32. Now, a business can be both a seller of services and a buyer of services. When you're in the role of a buyer, if you've paid the tax on your invoice, you do not need to remit use tax. But if a seller is, for example, a remote seller who's not meeting those thresholds, then perhaps they have not charged sales tax to you. And if they are not charging the sales tax and you are using these services in state, you're responsible for reporting the use tax, and that'll go on line 32. So that leads me next to who pays the tax. A buyer's responsible for paying the sales and use tax. And a buyer typically pays the tax to the vendor, as I just mentioned, and that vendor collects it and remits it to the state. However, if a vendor fails to collect the sales and use tax, as I said, the buyer using the tangible personal property or the digital code, digital product, or the taxable service in Maryland is responsible for remitting the use tax to the state. And there again, just another snip of line 32 to show where that would be reported. Next, I want to talk about effective date for the legislation and the impacts on contracts and subscriptions. This is another area where we've gotten a lot of questions, so we want to be clear here. Contracts for sales of digital or IT services and software publishing services that are entered into prior to July 1st, 2025 are not subject to the sales and use tax. Proper records must be maintained regarding the date and the terms of sale if no sales and use tax is collected, but if delivery or payment is going to be made after July 1st, 2025. We need to be able to see from the records that that contract was in fact entered into prior to July 1st, 2025. However, tax is due on subscription, leases, and other similar periodic type payments. And that's based on the subscription period, regardless of the length of the subscription or lease or the date that subscription or lease was entered into. Each subscription payment period is considered a separate sale for sales and use tax purpose. And payment for the new taxable services with subscription periods due on or after July 1st, 2025 are subject to tax at the 3% rate. So if there's an ongoing subscription, the May payment and the June payment will not have, for example, carry the sales tax, but a payment that's due, for example, on a monthly subscription for July and months afterwards, the tax needs to be included and charged on those payments. If you're a contractor who purchases data or IT services or software publishing services after July 1st, 2025, in order to perform a service that you are delivering as part of a contract that's entered into before July 1st, 2025, you have to pay the 3% sales and use tax. The contractor's cost of performance has increased. So again, I want to be clear there. If you are purchasing the services after July 1st, 2025, and you have not entered into your own contract. So you are performing a contract and you promise to perform that contract. And in order to do so, you need to buy some data or IT services. So you've got your own contract in order to complete the main contract. If you have not engaged a contract prior to July 1st, and you are going to make that purchase after July 1st, 2025, then you're going to have to pay sales tax. So that's where your cost of performance goes up. Now, if you have already arranged this and you are ongoing purchasing services currently prior to the July 1st date, then no, that will not change. That goes back to the first bullet point. You are in a contract that exists and you are making these purchases prior to July 1st, 2025. So it really depends on whether or not, even as someone who's fulfilling another contract, if you have made your own purchases and own contracts either before or after July 1st, 2025. Next, we'll talk about some special situations. There are two brand new exemptions that the legislature has passed. They apply specifically to the sale of digital and IT services and software publishing services. The first is sales of cloud computing to cybersecurity businesses. The second one is sales to or by certain qualified companies located in the University of Maryland's Discovery District. And then, as I said before, there are other exemptions that already exist in sales and use tax administration. And so to the extent that a sale meets one of those other exemptions and applies, then a vendor does not need to collect the sales and use tax. And a buyer does not need to pay. So for example, if there is a sale for resale, if you're making a purchase where the buyer intends to resell that taxable service in the same form that the buyer receives it, or intends to receive the service, and if they have not used the service themselves, then that they can purchase without paying the tax as a sale for resale. If you are selling services to a charitable or nonprofit tax exempt entity, and the vendor is not required the vendor there is not required to charge the tax if a buyer presents them with a valid exemption certificate. And just to let everyone know, if you're not familiar already, the exemption certificates that are issued to charitable and nonprofit entities are valid for a period of 5 years. They must be renewed prior to expiration. So if you are presented with an exemption certificate that is expired, a vendor is not allowed to accept that and must charge the tax. Next, I want to talk about a multiple points of use certificate. This is a new concept that was created by the legislature to address just the reality that many data and technical services are sold as software as well, are sold and used in multiple locations. So a multiple points of use certificate may be presented by a buyer who determines at the time of sale that the services being purchased are for use in Maryland and also outside of Maryland. The buyer will need to submit an application to the comptroller to use an MPU, a multiple points of use certificate. And then if approved, once a buyer provides the vendor with an MPU certificate, the vendor is relieved of their responsibility to collect and remit the tax, and the burden shifts to the buyer to remit the use tax for use in Maryland by an affiliated group. In that situation, the buyer, as we saw before, would report that use tax on that line 32 of the sales and use tax form. Additionally, another situation that we have here the law provides now, if a sales and use tax rate higher than 3% could be applied to a sale of tangible personal property, a digital code, digital product, or taxable service, then the higher rate will apply to the sale. So to give you an example there, SaaS that is sold to an individual is already subject to tax at the 6% rate as a digital product. However, SaaS that's sold for an enterprise system is exempt from the definition of digital product. So it's not taxable at 6% because there is a carve out there. However, under the new law as of July 1st, SaaS is included in one of those NAICS codes that are included in the new taxable services. So that sale SaaS as part of an enterprise system is an IT service that is subject to the 3% rate. Then I've got a few other non-technical miscellaneous updates from the 2025 legislative session. Go through those quickly as well. First, the sales and use tax rate for adult use cannabis increases from 9% to 12% effective July 1st, 2025. Law also exempts the sale of cannabis between a licensed cannabis business and a registered cannabis nursery. Cannabinoid beverages are excluded from the definition of food and are therefore taxable at the cannabis rate of 12%. There were some repeals of existing exemptions. First, repealing the exemption for snack food that is sold through vending machines. However, the exemption remains in place for vending machine sales of milk, fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, or yogurt. The exemption for sale of photographic materials, custom computer software are removed. And then also, there's a restriction now on the exemption for the sale of precious metal bullion or coins. So that only is in place for sales that occur at the Baltimore Convention Center. Those sales take place anywhere else. They are no longer exempt from the sales and use tax. I've gone through that a little quickly, but I wanted to make sure we had time to touch on everything, and thank you for your attention. I do want to turn this over now to my colleague who's going to give you some more specific information about how to register for sales and use tax account, as I said, on Maryland Tax Connect. But before I go, just the reminder, marylandcomptroller.gov is the place, the centralized location where you'll get all the information, including a copy of this webinar can be accessed. And again, encourage you, if you have additional questions, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A and we'll send them on. We will try and address them in future updates to that information on the website. I'll turn it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Good morning, thank you. Before I get started, I also do want to add that we will be publishing a copy of this presentation, the PowerPoint, on that dedicated webpage. We also have draft regulations that may answer a lot of the questions that we're seeing in the Q&A portion of the webinar. So those will be published by close of business today. We'll also have a recording of this webinar if you'd like to refer back to that. So before we get started, I am going to cover some of the basics for the Maryland Tax Connect portal and how to apply for a sales tax account. This would be for anyone that is new to filing sales tax. So before I get started, just a brief overview of what Maryland Tax Connect is, for those of you that might not be familiar. Maryland Tax Connect is the Comptroller's online service portal for Maryland business taxpayers. The agency launched the new self-service portal in February of 2024 as part of an ongoing system modernization initiative, replacing the previous B-File web application. Maryland Tax Connect offers various online services, such as applying for a business tax account, viewing business tax account information, correspondence history, as well as filing and paying on your Maryland business taxes. For those of you that are new to filing sales tax, today we'll take a look at what you can do now to prepare to start filing Maryland sales tax. For anyone that hasn't filed sales tax, as previously mentioned in this webinar, you will need to apply for a sales tax account by completing the combined registration application. And that application is available on our Maryland Tax Connect homepage. I'll be providing you with a brief demonstration of how to complete that application. And then we'll also take a look at starting your Maryland Tax Connect profile registration. Once you've submitted your application, you'll then be mailed your sales tax license, which will contain your Maryland Central Registration Number. The Maryland Central Registration Number is your Maryland tax ID. And you can't start filing your sales tax until you have been assigned a Maryland Central Registration Number. You'll also be mailed a Maryland Tax Connect letter containing a unique PIN that you'll use to link your tax account to your Maryland Tax Connect user profile. This will allow you to begin accessing your account information on Maryland Tax Connect, and you'll also be able to start filing and paying on sales tax. So with that being said, I'm going to share my screen and we will take a look at Maryland Tax Connect. With me just a moment. Okay, so here on my screen, you will see the Maryland Tax Connect homepage. The homepage is arranged in various different boxes that contain links to different resources, some within the Maryland Tax Connect portal and some that are housed on our marylandcontrollers.gov website. To apply for a sales tax account, you will navigate to the quick links box and we'll select the third link in the box. It says register a business in Maryland. That will soon be changed to apply for a Maryland business tax account. And you'll see here that this is the combined registration application. So we'll go ahead and click on that link. This will take you directly to our terms and conditions page where you'll agree to those terms and conditions at the bottom middle of the page. You'll click next. You'll then be prompted to enter some of your contact information. So go ahead and enter that. You'll then validate that you are not a robot by checking the box, and you'll click next. Here, this will take you directly into the combined registration application. You will answer all of the applicable fields. Here, these red asterisks identify each of the fields that are required. So those must be completed before you can proceed. So we'll go ahead and select ID type FEIN. That's your federal ID number. We'll enter the federal ID number. You're also required to enter the social security number of the owner, officer, or the responsible agent for taxes. You'll select the entity type. That should be business. You'll then indicate whether you are a Maryland resident. You'll select your business ownership type. and then you'll enter your business legal name. You'll then also indicate whether your mailing address and your physical location are the same. If they're not the same, you will enter in your mailing address first, and then you'll enter your physical address. They will say no. We will enter mailing address. Telephone number. You'll also select your Maryland County. And then you have the option to, if you would like to add a physical location address, if it is not the same as your mailing address. You'll then have, you'll see various check boxes, reason for applying. Now, if you do currently have a Maryland Central Registration Number and you're paying another type of business tax, such as withholding tax, you'll select Add Account. This will allow you to add a different tax type to your existing Central Registration Number. For anyone that is new to filing sales tax in Maryland or any type of business tax, you'll select New Business. So we'll click New Business today. You also need to indicate whether you'd like to add a previous owner or not. You'll then check the box that says Sales and Use Tax, and this will populate some other fields that you need to check. So we will enter in the first date of sales in Maryland. And then here you'll also see central registration numbers. If you do have an existing Maryland business tax account, you should enter in the existing central registration number in that field. This is also another field if you have a consolidated sales and use tax return account. Here you will check all that apply to your business. And then after you've done that, you'll scroll down to the bottom of the different tax types. And here you will enter in your NAICS code. This was previously discussed in our presentation. So you do have the ability to look that code up if you do not know what the code is. This here is information regarding cannabis sales, and you'll complete that if that applies to you. You'll click continue. You'll validate your address. Oh, we'll need to enter in our physical address. Here we go. Okay. Let's click continue. Okay, and then here on the next page, you'll need to enter in two related parties. You'll click add, you'll enter the name of that related party and the SSN. You'll enter the title. And then you will also enter in the address for that related party. You'll click continue, validate the address again. and you'll add another related party. Click continue. We'll click save and continue. You have the option to elect to receive filing coupons in the mail. If you choose not to receive those filing coupons, you leave the checkbox blank and click continue. We'll then have the signatory page or a power of attorney. If you have a power of attorney that is completing this form for you, they would check the box here and upload their Maryland power of attorney. If not, you'll then type in your name, and you'll type the name again as the electronic signature. If you are uploading a Maryland power of attorney form, you would simply select upload and you'll select your file, and that will be uploaded with this signatory page. Click continue. Bear with me. This is our testing environment, so it's a bit slower. Well, with the sake of time, you'll then, after this page, after you've submitted your application, you'll then be taken to an electronic acknowledgement page where you'll click the yes button, and that will take you directly to your confirmation page. The confirmation page will give you a confirmation number for your application. And at the end of the webinar, I will display some of the resources that are available where you can check the status of your application. Processing for the application is automatic, so it generally takes 3 to 5 business days for the application to process. So we do advise to allow about 7 to 10 business days to receive your sales tax license, as well as your Maryland Tax Connect PIN letter in the mail. We'll also quickly walk through registering for a Maryland Tax Connect account so that when you do receive that PIN letter, you can go ahead and link your tax account and begin filing and paying on sales tax. So these are 2 things that you can do now to prepare. To register for a Maryland Tax Connect account, you'll select the second link here. So we'll click on the second link. We'll go through the same page. It looks very similar to the application. You'll agree to your terms of service, and I indicate that you're not a robot. We'll click next. We'll then enter in your contact information, and you will create a proposed user ID. This is your user ID that you will use to log on to your Maryland Tax Connect profile. You'll also need to enter in your email address. This email address is used to retrieve a forgotten password, or when you reset your password or make any changes to your profile, you'll also be sent emails to this email address. Okay, we will electronically acknowledge, and then you will see that you have a confirmation number associated with your registration. We'll go ahead and click login. A temporary password is emailed to your email address. So we will go ahead and retrieve that password. Okay, and this is what the temporary password email looks like. It also has your registration confirmation number in it. Your temporary password is a long, unique password, so you can copy this password and you can paste it into the password field. You'll click login. You're then taken to a page where you need to select three security questions and provide answers to those. These security questions are used in the event that you have forgotten your password and need to use the forgotten password link. You would then be required to answer these 3 security questions accurately, and you would be sent a temporary password. So then we will enter the temporary password again, and you will create your own password. The password needs to be 14 characters in length. It needs to contain an uppercase, a lowercase, 1 number, and a special character. We'll click save after we've created our password. You'll then need to log in one more time. And you'll click login. You're then sent a email to enter in multi-factor authentication code. Bear with me and I'll retrieve that email. This has a 6-digit code, so you'll enter that 6-digit code into the field. Click verify. And then you're taken to the final page in your registration. As a tax administrator, you will use the unique PIN to link your tax account. So here you will use the first option that you're requesting administrator access to your tax account, and you have a PIN, and that would be on your Maryland Tax Connect letter. If you have an existing sales tax account and you have you are new to Maryland Tax Connect, you can use the second option. The second option will just require you to validate your tax information here on this page. We'll go back. And you'll need to select, I am requesting administrator access to my tax account and have a PIN. Now you do need to stop at this point if you're creating your Maryland Tax Connect profile now, but still waiting on your sales tax license. So as soon as you receive that Maryland Tax Connect letter with the unique PIN on it, you can log back into your account. It will take you back to this page and you'll be able to link your account using that PIN. Once you've done so, you'll be taken to the user dashboard and you'll be able to start filing and paying on your Maryland sales tax. So that concludes our demonstration for today. I am going to share a page with some Maryland Tax Connect resources. Should you need any additional help or assistance. With me just a moment. And like I previously mentioned, this will also be published to our informational page on you can access additional information, FAQs, previously recorded Maryland Tax Connect webinars. We also have step-by-step guides and tutorials for any transactions you're trying to complete on Maryland Tax Connect. Those are available on the Business Tax Services page of the marylandcomptroller.gov website. You can also access the Maryland Tax Connect homepage by navigating to mdtaxconnect.gov. Taxpayers that are requiring registration or navigational assistance on Maryland Tax Connect can schedule a call back appointment using a link that is at the top of the Maryland Tax Connect homepage. Those callbacks can assist you with anything related to your Maryland Tax Connect account. Any business tax specific questions, such as anything on collecting sales tax, would need to go through our taxpayer services division. You can also check the status of your combined registration application by emailing centralregistration@marylandtaxes.gov. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us. We hope that the information in the webinar and presentation today has been helpful for you. Please, again, visit our marylandcomptroller.gov website for additional updates and resources.